I'm Leaane Hinton from UC Berkeley, and I work with the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. I give a lot of workshops on teaching methods, and I think a lot about teaching methods, especially for languages like the ones here where there aren't very many people that know the language, and I thought a lot about how do you teach the language if you don't know the language fluently, and of course how do you teach language if you do know the language fluently too. Today I'm not really talking about teaching methods so much as curriculum development. This is the first time I've given a workshop in many years on curriculum development, and I'm looking forward to it. So what I thought we'd start out with is sort of some definitions, right? So on the agenda it says defining terms, curriculum, units, and lessons. Let's start with lessons because that's an obvious one, right? So a lesson is what you're teaching to a group of people or to somebody else or even to yourself if you've got a self-taught thing. A lesson is what you do in a session. And so it's what you're teaching in a session. And then, but lessons can go together in units. So this morning, James was talking about acorns. And if you're going to teach language around acorns, you could probably have a whole lot of lessons, right? So you might start out with a lesson where you're presenting the different kinds of acorns and pictures of the trees and talking about the names of the different kinds of acorns and trees, and maybe talk about how you use them. And some of that, if you're not a fluent speaker, a lot of that might be in English, but the names would definitely be in the language that you're teaching. And then there might be another lesson where you actually take a field trip and go gather acorn or something. And then there might be another lesson where you're teaching people how to cook and eat acorn. And all of this can be something where language is learned in each of these. And so together that's a unit. And so all of that can take place in the language, and it might be 3 or 4 or 5 different lessons, and that's what a unit is. So a unit then would be a set of lessons that go together under a theme. And then curriculum, I mean, I still try to look up curriculum in the dictionary and everything to try to figure out how exactly do you describe what curriculum is. But curriculum is basically a larger thing than a unit. It's what you're teaching over a long period of time. And and it can take several forms. I mean, it can just be, okay, that's everything we taught last year, that was our curriculum last year. But of course, the whole point of us talking about curriculum is that you can plan in advance what it is that you're going to teach. And so, in a way, this is what this is really about is curriculum planning. I'm going to show you some examples of curriculum that has not only been planned, but it's been written down in ways that other people can use. And that's the other point about what a curriculum is as I say, basically curriculum is just what you teach. But what you hope to do is to plan your curriculum in such a way that either you or somebody else can teach it in the future too. But this is a book that I just got in the mail Friday, and it's a Lakota it's a one-year curriculum for kids from like 1st to 3rd grade, but it's also got a lot more in it than that. Here's the content of the book that talks about what kinds of lessons there are in it, and it's a curriculum, it's a guide, so it talks to teachers and parents about how to use the book and how to teach lessons in it. And it also has worksheets that you can copy and pass out to the students. And so this is basically a one-year curriculum. And I'll pass that around. And then this is a different kind of thing. This was something that I worked with the Havasupai tribe on in the 80s. And they live in Arizona. And this was for bilingual education. So it's for the Havasupai part of bilingual education. And because it was bilingual education, they had various things that they were wanting to teach: speaking and listening and reading and writing and grammar and vocabulary and a unit on American Indian languages. And so it's in a notebook because what people can do is they can add to it by having it be in a binder like this. And so this was a curriculum that was developed by a bunch of teachers and me together over a period of a couple of years. It has in it the goals and levels and how to develop reading skills and so forth. So it's actually called a curriculum guide because it not only has a whole lot of lessons in it, but it's a guide for teachers on how to teach. I remember one year there was one chairwoman of a tribe that said that she was going to have her council always vote yes and no now in her language. And but there's a little bit of warning about that too, because because she started enforcing it, but then the first thing they voted on turned out nobody was clear on which word meant yes and which word meant no, and so she got in real trouble because she thought that it had passed and other people thought that it hadn't passed. In New Mexico, some of the pueblos that have really strong values about politeness and traditions about how to treat elders and so on, they're teaching the little kids how to speak to an elder and what to say when you greet them and that kind of thing, and everybody feels like it really has increased the community spirit. Yeah, what we're going to do is lay out just sort of the bare skeletal outline, I think, of a year's worth of curriculum, and what it would look like. We're going to start out with just sort of looking at language topics, sort of just try to make a whole list of topics of language that, which will be kind of broad, because there's, when you first think, well, what do we want to teach the kids? You think about things like animal names and so forth, but then also just we'll think of activities, right? So there's classroom activities. If you're teaching in a classroom, there are things that people talk about in the classroom. And so, for example, things like snack time, or things like reading, or just classroom instructions like sit down and let's form a circle and that kind of thing. And so those would be things that you'd want to do language around also. And then there's activities of various sorts. So drawing or writing and so on, you could use language around those. And then there's other kinds of activities like that the community does. So there's what does the community do during the year? What are some of the ceremonies or regular events and so on? And language can be around those. So we won't just think about language per se. We won't just think about what kinds of words are there, but we'll also think about what kinds of activities are there. And all human activities involve language, and so we'll talk about what kind of language gets involved with each of these activities. I don't know if you've heard of TPR or not, but TPR is total physical response, and it's a theory that says that you learn language through actions, through touching things, through seeing things, you don't learn language by being taught words. You learn language through experience. And so TPR is you give people experience and you attach the language to the experience. First, we'll just make just a list of the kinds of things we want to teach, and then by the end of the day we'll get down into lesson plans that brings in the kinds of things Cynthia's talking about where an actual lesson plan is a plan where you're saying, well, what are the goals of this lesson? What's the, what kind of language, or what are the words that I'm going to teach during this lesson? What are the materials I need, such as the objects that those words stand for? What kinds of activities are we going to do that help us practice those words? So games and things like that, that if, for example, as Cynthia was saying, if you're teaching animals, you bring in puppets or something, and then you can have all kinds of games and activities around that, where the real goal is that they're learning those words, using those words during the activity. And then what are the, how do you know whether the kids have learned it too? Assessment, that's part of any lesson. But we'll get to that probably this afternoon sometime when we're really developing specific lessons. To begin with, what we're going to do is very sketchy, because we're just going to say, what kind of words do we want to do? Well, animal names. But we won't go any further than that yet until we get down to lessons as to how we're going to teach the animal names. As I say on the agenda here, when you're going to make a curriculum, one of the things you want to look at is what resources do you have, language resources in particular. And if you're somebody like Cynthia, you've got the language in your head, and that's the most important resource of all. But a lot of us don't know the language very well, and so we depend more on resources like Joanne was talking about, of dictionaries and some lesson plans that Catherine Callahan made. And so you might have linguistic materials that have been collected, or you might have a grammar that somebody made, or so these are the other kinds of resources that we need to look at. And so Erica, you brought this gigantic box. Maybe you could tell, now that's a set of resources that we can start with. What's in that box? Now see what she's done here is she's organized a lot of the vocabulary and stuff that she has into this, into these 3-ring binders, so that they'll be available for her to use again. That's what you do when you come down to Berkeley. Thank you, Erica. Wow. Now she has a lot of resources that she's created, and some of you are starting from an earlier stage and don't have a lot of created things yet, but might have some resources from which you can work. So, for example, Joanne has field notes, and I should have written down dictionaries. So she has a dictionary, and CDs, and what else do you have yet in the? And some lesson plans, maybe 4 lesson plans, right? So you've got some lesson plans. Sort of make a list, maybe now, of the kinds of resources that you have already that you can develop lessons from, or go to develop lessons from. So, for example, if you've got speakers, if you've got a linguist that's working with you, these are also resources, right? Ishi, the Yahi Indian, that was the last speaker of Yahi. Now, before Ishi came out of the woods and ended up with A.L. Kroeber, before that, this linguist Edward Sapir had done a study of male and female speech in Yana, which is very closely related language, Northern Yana. And men and women spoke quite differently. They had different pronunciations and a little bit of different grammar. But Ishi, who was a completely fluent speaker who didn't even know English or anything else, he used the women's forms. And it was because of how he had learned. I mean, he had been, had such a restricted social life that he didn't end up learning the men's forms. And I guess I would say, don't be discouraged, because as Ishi showed the language changes, and it's just not, he was using the language all the time, and one could learn from him and think one really knew the language, but it's really quite different from what his language had been a generation ago, just because of the social change. And languages do change because of the social circumstances. If a living language will change because of the social circumstances. And so I know that this is worth a lot of debate, but my feeling is that you should accept whatever you can and realize that it's going to be different from what it was a generation or two ago. Try to make it as close as you can, but to know that okay, it's going to be different because the social circumstances are different, because the way we learned it is different. It's going to be different, but it's what we've gotten. We can still use it. There's this whole thing whenever people are revitalizing their language that you have to go into this giant word development thing, right? You have to develop all these new words if you're going to talk about it every day. And that makes people uncomfortable too, because if you were to then, you have this gigantic new vocabulary, and if there is an elder left who speaks the language, he'll say, well, I don't understand a word you're saying. It makes you sad because you see how much has been lost. And it's sort of like when we have a cabin down in the Noyo River Valley, and I always think there's these beautiful, beautiful redwoods down there, and I just love it. But then I look at the stumps of the redwoods that used to be there, and it makes me sad. And I guess that's the way it is with language. There was something very, very rich there that you'll never get back, but you'll still have those redwoods of language that are growing back again. The Hawaiians have been the most successful group in the United States as far as language revitalization goes. They have 2,000 or 3,000 new speakers because they've been able to get all the way from preschool through 12th grade with Hawaiian as the language of instruction now. But they have a lexicon committee, it's called, and that committee meets once a month to determine what the new words should be for the various items that have been sent in to them from the teachers in the classroom and so on. And they make up hundreds of, or either make up or choose between choices or figure a policy for just hundreds and thousands of new words all the time. One of James's best resources is a big long word list that he collected over the last year or so with Nelson Hopper, and that has a whole lot of words and a whole lot of sentences. And since it's hard and some of you might be in the same position, it's hard for James to get much more right now in the way of language than what he has already gotten from Nelson. And so what he'd want to do is to develop his curriculum around the words that he has and around the phrases he has. I brought a word list for a curriculum that I had developed for Manzanita, which is in San Diego County, and it's so it's Kumeyaay. And the Manzanita had another reluctant speaker. They had a reluctant speaker who, even though the head of the language group, the head of the language program was the daughter of this man, she couldn't get him to give her any more vocabulary. And so she had this 500-word list. And what we did was we went through the list and we put it on Excel. If you know the Excel program on your computer. So what you can do in Excel is you can write. You have these different columns basically, or different fields, and so you can. So we wrote the English in one field and the Kumeyaay in another field. And then what we also did was we put down what kind of word it was in a third field. So this was animals and bingo words, body parts, and colors and clothing and directions and drinks and so forth. And by having a field that put down what kind of word it was, we could, the nice thing about Excel is that you can sort it any way you want. And so, for example, in your dictionary that you just got from Catherine, if she had something that, if it was on your computer and you had what kind of word it was, then you could sort it by the kinds of words and you would know, okay, well, when I want to do something on animals, here's all my animal words. I don't have to go through the dictionary and find all the animal words. I've got it sorted so they'll be right here. The next thing that I want us to go through is just to start making lists of things that we want to teach and learn, and we'll make a sort of a mishmash of a list together, but I want each of you to be thinking about what resources you have, what language resources you have, so that you're, at least in your own mind, you're going to make a sort of a realistic list, right? So with James, he'll be thinking about his the big list of words that he's got, words and phrases that he's got, and that's sort of a closed set of language materials from which he can then develop this curriculum. One of the lists we're going to make here is lists of activities, and that'll include things like what you just said of seeing and hearing. And these are sort of, what can I say, one verb activities, but there's also the larger scale activities like playing bingo or something like that, which is another kind of activity that would include a lot of verbs and things in it. But let's start out with a calendar instead. And what I mean by calendar is, let's think of things that go on in your community that that people do, or that are somehow important for people to do. And they can be things like, and I guess I'm thinking of sort of once a year or once a month type activities. And they can be things like Christmas, right? So that's one thing that I guess people might have something to do with. And they can also be things like Big Head dance. Now the Big Head then is an important activity for Clear Lake in general, I guess. And so that would be something for the communities around Clear Lake. You'd want to have some kind of both cultural and language lessons around the Big Head. So culturally, of course, you want the kids to know what it is and so forth. But what about the names for the regalia, the names for things that you do at Big Head? So there's eating dinner and all of these things that you can be developing language lessons around. And so probably in September is when you'd be wanting to, if you had a bunch of kids that were meeting with you every week, starting in September you might want to be talking about the Big Head and doing language lessons around the Big Head so that the kids would then be fully prepared. One very successful language program is the Cochiti Pueblo that I have visited occasionally, and what they do they have a language program that's a summer language program where they run intensive all-day language camps all summer long, and so the kids are with this fairly large group of staff all summer long. They're a group where anybody over about 40 speaks the language, so they have lots of staff that can just immerse the kids in the language. But they base their whole summer session, their whole summer program on ceremonies, so that it's the ceremonial cycle. And in the summertime in Cochiti, there's lots of important religious ceremonies, and they're constantly preparing the kids for the ceremonies. They're telling them, how do you greet people? What do you say to the dancers, or what, if anything, or what do you say to your elders when? And they're going to serve dinner, and what are the names of the food at the dinner, and how are you going to, what are you going to do for this? Or maybe even you can prepare your class to be doing something like, I don't want to say anything inappropriate, but say serving dinner to the elders or something like that, that they're going to play a role perhaps in this ceremony. And you'd probably want to be working with the people that are doing the actual dancing to figure out what is appropriate for these kids to participate in. And this becomes a very exciting thing for the children. because it means that they're going to be involved, they're going to understand what's happening, and possibly even play a role and use their language. So remember, at the very beginning of today, I talked about units versus lessons, and so here this would be a big head unit. And so meaning of the big head. And you might in September say want to invite someone that knows a lot about big head to come and just talk to the kids about the meaning of the big head. Since most of you are in a situation where even the teachers are not fluent speakers of the language, a lot of this would take place in English. But there's a lot of language that can come up. So like, what are the names of the 4 directions that you turn in? And there's going to be a feast, a dinner. So what's the kinds of things that people used to eat at dinner? What are some of the things that you might see at the dinner? Just regular modern food, and maybe also some traditional foods that will come. And so the names of those foods, and then you can start thinking about what are some phrases that I can use in my language that will relate to this. So you can say, for example, you can teach the kids how to say "let's eat," or you can teach the kids, if you're going to involve the children in serving in any way or giving things in any way, you can teach them phrases like, would you like some acorn mush? Would you like some water? Would you like those kinds of things? So think about the language that you can use from the resources you have in these lessons. Okay, so there's the meaning of the big head, roundhouse etiquette, the phrases to use to serve or give or greet people. This can also be a lesson about different languages, right? That you might say, well, not everybody around Clear Lake spoke the same language, and so what I'm teaching you is what you say to our people, but it's not necessarily what you say to people from Elem. You can see that I'm not really thinking about language lessons right now. I'm thinking about activities, and then you figure out what kind of language can I bring in to these activities. And like Cynthia and Erica were both saying, it seems like people learn better when you teach them useful language. And it's useful because it's part of these activities. So by thinking first of activities and then thinking about what language can go around it, you're bringing in useful language. I could see 4 to 8 lessons in here. And so one of them would be, maybe an introductory lesson would be Introduction to Big Head. And it would probably involve, that lesson would probably involve a discussion with the students about what do they know about Big Head, have they ever heard of it? Just have them tell you what they know about it. And have they ever been to a Big Head dance, and what do they know about how you're supposed to behave? So it would be involve discussion of meaning and activities and behavior, sort of from the student's point of view. So 3 or 4 words, basic words relating to the Big Head. And then a second lesson, maybe that would be where you get a guest, like somebody who's involved with Big Head or who knows a lot about it, to come in and talk about it. And he would, that person, he or she would talk about the meaning and whatever's appropriate to talk about, the meaning and the etiquette things may work out differently, but these are possibilities. So you could get somebody, the captain or somebody, to come and talk to them again, and this is in September, so, or late September or something like that, so it's before everything happens, but not so long before they forget about it, but maybe before the captain gets too busy with preparations for the big head. And then, and also 3 to 4 words. Now, maybe the regalia, the names of the parts of the regalia, for example, would be a possible set of words that could be taught. And let's see, so that was lesson 2, and lesson 3 would be maybe this would be something that you would prepare after hearing the captain. You'd hear things that that you'd want to talk about linguistically next time. So maybe the 4 directions. Maybe he would have said you turn in the 4 directions and then you sit down. And so you teach the kids the 4 directions. And plus some politeness or some politeness phrases. Like, how do you greet people in your language? And if the kids are actually going to be involved in some way, you're going to have at least one lesson of planning for what they're going to be doing. Like, are you going to bring food? Okay, so let's plan what you're going to bring, and let's give the names of the food to you too. So. So this could be, for example, a food lesson. Right. Or whatever it is that they're going to be involved with, you can teach them vocabulary and phrases around what they're doing, around their involvement, or around their way of interacting. And then, of course, so that's 4 lessons, and then 5 is going to the big head dance, where it's actually instead of a lesson, they actually go. Are kids allowed? Oh, yeah. Yeah. So they know how to. So in this process, they've learned how to behave. They've learned the meaning of the big head. They've learned, and they've learned at least 16 to 20 phrases or vocabulary items that relate to the big head dance. What other events can you think of that are important or that happen every year that the community is involved in? Somebody's Acorn, and that's this time of year too, right?
We have big tends to happen in the summertime, June to August.
Oh, good. So you could have this any time of year in the end, and then, but Acorn's only one time a year that you gather them, right? Okay, what else? What other things should go on this calendar from any of your communities? What? Hitch run?
Hitch, yeah.
If that's fish? Seaweed gathering. Anything else? You're trying to create a body of material that other people can use to teach in the future. And if, for example, but there's some things that you can't leave for them. But what you can leave for them is guidance. Besides materials, you can leave guidance. So a curriculum plan involves a lot of things like guidance. And so one of the things would be get a guest to get the local captain to come talk to the kids, right? So that's what you would that's your legacy for that lesson, is to get a local captain to come talk to the kids. So you're not leaving pictures, and you're not leaving the details of what this captain's going to say. You're not making any statement about, you know, what's right or what's wrong. You're going to leave it to somebody to talk about. And the curriculum that we're developing here is really a set of just guides for people as to how to teach things. And so that's certainly going to be part of it. Okay. Anything in Hopland that isn't on this list that happens once a year or happens on an irregular basis? And what do you think about including non-traditional things in your calendar, like, I don't know, Halloween? Do the kids go trick-or-treating around here on Halloween? Dress up in costumes and things like that? Do they? So Halloween could be, could also be could also have some language around it, right? So what people dress up as, what are some of the vocabulary for the various things that people dress up as? So words like scary, you know, those kinds of things. Again, you'd probably start out with you'd have one lesson that's just a discussion with the kids. But what do you know about Halloween, and how do you practice Halloween? What do we do on Halloween? And give them 3 or 4. And you'd say, you know, Halloween is not something that we used to do. This is a holiday that's come in along with a white man, and we do that now. But it's not something that we did back in the old days. But we did have things in the old days that were scary and so forth too, and so you could sort of bring it into, like you're suggesting, bring in some traditional things with it. And then again, 3 or 4 words. So, and by the way, every lesson has to involve review too, that you're always going to be reviewing things that the kids have already learned. And so if the kids have learned animal names, and so what are some of the things that you could dress up as? And you could review, say, some people dress up as a wolf, right? And so you review what's the word for wolf, and witch. Do we have a word for witch? And did we have anything in the old days that was like a witch? You know, and so you can bring in language through the costumes. And what do you get? You get candy. So you can bring in any words that you know in your language that relate to some of the activities of Halloween. And whether you want more than one lesson in this unit, I don't know. You know, maybe this would just be a 1-unit lesson, a 1-lesson unit. Or maybe you'd have a second one where the kids are dressing up for the class, where they come in their costumes, and you could use phrases like, "Oh, that one's a really scary costume," or "That one's a happy costume," or "That's or you could afterwards you could talk about, did you get lots of candy? Did you go trick-or-treating?" and so forth. If you have a Halloween party, it could be talking about the costumes in the language, and it could also be serving. If you're having a party, you're having food. So serving food is one of the first things that probably classroom kids learn. Is you would say in Pomo, "Do you want some milk? Do you want some this?" And you're teaching the kids to say, "Yes, I'd like some milk," and so forth. And so the food part of the party can be in the language too. So whatever activities that the language can be brought into, you bring the language into it. You might not have a word for costume, but you might be able to say, "What will you wear?" Or you might be able to, in the language, or you might, something along that line, or "What will you be?" And it could be a good time too, in any of these things where where you want to talk to the kids about what's right and what's wrong. You might want to talk to the kids before Halloween and say, or maybe this would insult the parents if you did, so you might not, but you might want to say, well, if we're pretending things, if we're pretending to be something, what would you want to pretend to be? And say, but, or what would you wear? Maybe we wouldn't wear our regalia because that's not pretend, that's real stuff. And so when is it right to wear our regalia? We wear our regalia during certain ceremonies, but not during Halloween. So you could bring that out. What are we actually teaching? Are we teaching writing, reading and writing, or are we teaching speaking? Because you don't have to write down the words for the kids at all. You just can pronounce them and have them pronounce it back. For preschool, for example, you probably wouldn't be writing down the words, because you're really just teaching them how to speak. And I often feel that when you're teaching language, in a lot of ways, writing it down is not something you ever have to do. It's a lot of fun when you've got beautiful materials, like Erica has, and there is, there's nothing wrong with writing it down, but a lot of times with the languages around here, since there's no official writing system, you get into some real difficulties with how you're going to write it if you decide you're going to write it down. And so if you've got those kinds of difficulties about how you're going to write it, or if you've got, I know a lot of people have political issues over which writing system to use, and all of this stuff, maybe it's better just to teach it orally and not write it down. Well, let me say there's two reasons why you'd want to write things. One is that you want to write things for the teacher, so that even if you're not using writing to teach the children, you want to probably write things down for yourself so that you know what words there are and you know how to pronounce them and so forth. And so in a lesson plan, you'll probably have all the vocabulary written down that you're going to teach that day, whether or not you actually show it to the kids. Now, another thing you might want to do is at the end of each lesson, you might want to give the kids a handout to take home. It says, these are the words we learned today. And go home and use them with your parents and practice them and show your parents what you learned today. And so, that would be another time. Sometimes people want to write them down as part of the class, but you don't really have to. You can just use it in the class and then give them the written form. I have a handout for you guys, which I'm not giving you yet because I want you to have it. But I'm trying to brainstorm here with you, and I don't want you to see all my notes that might keep you from brainstorming. So a lot of times it's just using the language is the best way to teach it rather than writing it down. If you had a language class for kids, you'd want to have probably, again, if these were, 20-minute lessons or something like that, you'd probably have several lessons. And there's the really important meaning and everything that you want to teach them, and then you would also think what kinds of words, what kinds of vocabulary, what kinds of phrases can go with these lessons that we would learn. So the histories and tribes, the geography, where the walk took place and where everybody's from and all of that. And etiquette, again, are you going to involve these children somehow in this walk? Are they going to be part of the walk? Are they perhaps would you like to take them to the end of the walk to greet everybody and give them food, or what are ways that the kids could become part of this event and that you're teaching and feel like they're a part of it? And then the fourth would be their actual participation in the walk itself. And then each one of these, again, what kind of language can we use? Place names is maybe part of the language of the geography of the walk. And just phrases like a long walk, or like this walk takes how many days, and how many people, right? So you get numbers in there, and just be thinking about what kind of language can we use that we know about, that we have, or that we can find out. What kind of phrases can we teach them that are related to all of this? The reason I wanted to do a calendar, this isn't going to be what all your lessons are about by any means, but just that when you're doing a year's curriculum, one of the things that you can do for planning the year is to plan that some of your lessons are going to be around these events. And so when you're making a curriculum for your own community, start out making a calendar of events that are important to your community. And then say, okay, we're going to, in some you might decide not to use, but some we're going to use. We're going to say we're going to do one of the big head dances. So one of our units will be on Big Head, and it'll take place somewhere around that time. And one of our units will be on acorns. It'll be around the time that we want to do acorn gathering. So this will be sort of some of the some of your lessons. Okay, now let's look at activities. First of all, there's, as we were saying before, there's verbs. That verbs are actions, and so one of the things, there's these activities that we do, or actions that we do, like sitting and standing and so forth. And tell the truth, I think I'll put this over with words and phrases. So seeing, hearing, sitting, other verbs or action words. So that's one kind of vocabulary. Okay, let's think of activities on a higher scale, a broader scale. There's activities like, let's see, Erica brought up hide and seek. Yeah, there's all kinds of games, and if we have time this afternoon, we'll really focus on games toward the end of the day. But so there's all kinds of games that you can play, and that's one kind of activity. Another kind of activity might be a puppet shows. In the case of James here, there's creating radio and TV shows is one of the things he's doing. And these are activities that you can actually involve the children in, either teenagers, as James is doing, or you could even say, okay, we're going to have, for preschool, we're going to do a puppet show, and each day we're going to do a little bit toward the creation of this puppet show. And so it might be a puppet show where the kids are telling a story in Pomo. And so the first day, I mean, so that's the goal. And you tell the kids about this because it'll excite them. They're working toward a goal. And the first day they'll learn maybe the names of the puppets, and then bit by bit you'll teach them some of the actions that the puppets are going to do and some of the things that the puppets are going to say. And you might want to tell them a story toward the beginning too, because in the end they're going to be talking about, that's what they're going to be enacting. Let's say that you've got a story in Pomo that's been collected by some linguist or something like that. You could actually get that whole story told in Pomo. And another thing you could do is turn a story into a play where each child has a few lines. And so it might be a traditional story or something else where it's acted out as a play instead of as a narrated story. So there's a story, just for example, a story I learned in Baja California. It's in Baja California, the Kumeyays down there tell a lot of stories that are kind of European and Indian mixed stories. And there's one about a coyote who comes to a farm and says to the rooster, there's this whole chicken family, and he says to the rooster, I'm going to take you to, or I'd like to take you to the, no. He says, I'd like to take one of your kids to the mission so he can go to school. And the rooster says, okay, and the coyote takes him and eats him, right? And then he comes back again the next day and says, that little kid that I took to school is really lonesome for his brother. I'm going to take the brother to school, okay, so that he can be with the kid and not be alone. And then he takes him and eats him. And then he comes back and says to the hen, your kids want you, and he takes him and eats him. A horrible little story. And then and then the farmers, the woman comes out of her house and says, where did all my chickens go? And so I could see something like that little story being acted out by the kids, where somebody's acting out the coyote, and then each little chicken is being acted out, and so on. So there's a lot of ways you can handle a story, either as a narration or you can turn it into a play, and it can all take place in Pomo or in Miwok. And what you do in this case is you would probably take weeks and weeks where you're spending a little bit of time each day learning something about this, and either learning lines or learning or hearing the story or learning the names of the animals and so forth. So it's a multiple language lessons with a goal in mind that the kids get increasingly excited about, and then finally they get to actually show their parents in a big show. And so that would be a unit that takes quite a while. So what are some other activities? Now these are kind of these are classroom kind of activities that we've been thinking about. Snack time is another activity. Actually, arrival in the classroom is an activity that can have a lot of language around it, of greetings and telling people to sit down and where they can put their coats and all of that. And so, so these are kind of classroom activities. And then there's other activities that aren't necessarily arising from the classroom culture, but that you can bring into the classroom. And some of the activities that have been done around here are things like tule boat making. Things, a lot of these are activities, of course, that are on the calendar, but what are some of other activities that aren't on the calendar that you can think of that would be basketry? Hunting, fishing. Yeah. Got those over here. And as we think of these activities, some of them might end up on your calendar because there's certain times a year you hunt certain kinds of things and so on. What else? What are some other activities of any kind, just whatever comes to mind? Nature walks. Boat trips. These are kind of field trip activities. Camping. Going to the coast. Okay. What are some other activities that don't involve field trips, but that could be? Community gatherings. Oh yeah, cooking, eating. Singing, dancing. sports. In Hawaii, they actually got a big grant from some, you're talking about where do you get grants? Well, think about think about community development grants. And they got a big grant from some community development organization for creating a basketball team. And everything that they did had to be in the Hawaiian language. And so it was both a language activity and a sports activity. They had grants from bilingual education grants, and I don't know where they got all their money, or where they get all their money, but they get grants from, they get things like I think Apple gave them a bunch of computers and software, and they got a grant from somebody to help them make Hawaiian language programs, right? So that they all the instructions for Microsoft Office, for example, are in Hawaiian now, that they can actually use the computer in Hawaiian. There's this new book by Jon Stewart, who has this show, The Daily Show on Comedy Central, and has this, yeah, it's called America the Book, and has a timeline of the history of democracy, and it says 1492, the day America discovered the white man. Okay, now you can see that what we're doing here is we're starting to get enough topics here to develop a year's curriculum out of it. But there's also, we've been talking about activities and things on the calendar. We don't want to forget words and phrases, right? That they're in grammar. There's just language things that you want to make sure that your students learn, and they may end up being part of some of the activities that we've already listed, or they may be lessons in themselves that are separate from the activities. So besides making sure that they learn a lot of verbs, what other kinds of words and phrases do we want to make sure the kids learn? Question words. Politeness words like thank you and so forth. If you've got them, I don't know whether it's, in some, in Havasupai, there's no word for hello, and there's no word for goodbye, and there's no word for please, and there's no word for thank you. And and so I said, well, but what do you say to each other when you greet each other? And they'd say, well, if we see him walking down the trail and I'm walking up the trail, I say, where are you going? And he says, I'm going to town, or whatever. And then what do you say if you haven't seen somebody for a really long time? Then we sit down and we cry together because of all the people that we know have died since we last saw each other. So traditionally there was, and what do you say if you think the food is really good? You say it's good. So you might not have words for hello, goodbye, and so forth, but you do have words that can fit into those situations. And I've been thinking about greetings, that even though in some languages people didn't used to greet each other, of course you can say things like how are you and so forth, even if, and the question is, if people didn't used to say that, do you want to say it now? And I think that there's a new meaning to greetings in your language that wasn't there before. I mean, it used to be that maybe you didn't have to greet each other because you lived in a community where everybody saw each other every day, and so there wasn't a need to greet each other. And it wasn't a tradition, you just were living together, and that was it. But now, I think now when you greet each other in your language, it's a statement saying, we do belong to this community together that speaks this language together, and it's sort of an assertion that we are a community, even though we've been torn apart in the past, and that our language, being able to say something to each other in our language, is an assertion of that community. What are some other kinds of words and phrases that you want people to learn? I mean, of course, there's the basic stuff, right? We don't want to, I mean,
How to address your relatives.
what? How to address your relatives. When you've got speakers, one is hesitant sometimes to use materials that speaker doesn't know, right? But there might be materials like what the anthropologists collected 100 years ago that would have some of those missing words. New words it can actually be really fun lessons for kids, because if you don't, because they can make them up with you, right? You can talk about, okay, how I think some of you already heard me say that the Mutsons in the Bay Area have been making up a lot of new words, and that one of the, I was sitting around with them once when they were saying, well, how will we say Burger King? And they decided, okay, we're going to call Burger King Chief of the Round Meat. And so then from then on, whenever they went to Burger King, they could say, let's go to Chief of the Round Meat in Mutsun. And so you could have fun lessons with kids to be saying, how would we say something like this in our language? And take words that they know and make phrases that they can use. You guys are coming up with the really important stuff, but there's also the basic vocabulary that people have to learn. So there's, numbers, animals, colors, clothing, food, just all these things. And so those will form a lot of lessons too. You say, okay, well, we're going to, how are we going to teach numbers? Well, one of the things that you would do for teaching numbers is you might say, all right, we're going to have a lesson where the kids are supposed to learn the numbers 1 to 5. And, but again, as several of you have said, if you just teach words, they don't retain them. But if you're using it in activities, then people retain them. And so some of these activities that you've already been talking about can be activities where you're teaching the numbers 1 through 5, or like maybe you can combine vocabulary together. So, well, let's say it's Halloween, and let's say that you got a party and there's some candy involved. Then you can count the pieces of candy together. You can say each of you can have 5 pieces of candy. Now count out 5, and you can take them. Or maybe you don't want to serve candy, but there would be other things that you can count. So you're thinking, well, when I teach numbers, it's because I'm going to be teaching things that we can count together. And so even when you're thinking of words, or when you, let's say clothing, when I'm teaching clothing, we'll probably go around and sort of talk about what people are wearing. And so there'll be an activity that you use to teach words in. So even these basic vocabulary involves activities in order to teach it. Okay, let's think about grammar. I heard one thing about grammar, which was word order. That people, or that Pomo has a different word order, that instead of saying the girl petted the cat, you'd say something like the girl the cat petted, or something like that. Some languages are what we call free word order languages. For example, in English, you have to say the girl kissed the boy. And so you have the girl first, and then the verb, and then what she kissed. And we have to have that word order. But in a lot of languages, you would have other ways of telling who did what, right? So I mean, the reason we have to have that word order is because if we changed it to if we change the word order, then it changes the meaning, right? So if we change it to the boy kissed the girl, that means something different from the girl kissed the boy. But in some languages, you have ways of telling who did what, because one word is marked as the subject, and another noun might be marked as the object, and so it doesn't matter what order you put in it, you still know who did it and who it did to. And so in a lot of those languages, it's free word order just because it's marked in a different way. You start with one thing, and you don't have to explain all that complexity to your students, right? You eventually have to understand it yourself as the teacher, but you don't have to explain it because they can get it bit by bit. And you don't have to translate every...
By usage, though, it naturally develops.
Right. And so, for example, in Kashaya, and maybe this is true in the other Pomo languages too, if you ask an elder, what's the word for hit? He's going to say, well, hit how? Hit with your fist, hit with a bat, hit with what? Because there's no one word for hit. But you don't have to at first say that to your students. You just say, if you're playing baseball, you say hit the ball, and it's going to happen that word for hit has a prefix on it that means you're hitting it with a long object. But you don't have to explain that to the students. You just say hit the ball, and they'll learn that. And then later on, when you say, oh, don't hit to some kid that's hitting another kid, you're going to use a different word. And maybe your students will say, but I thought hit was this word for hit the ball, and then you can say, well, but when you're hitting with your fist, you say something different. And then later on, it'll come out that there's yet another word for hit. And they'll learn it a little bit at a time, and they might just learn it without even asking any questions, or they might at some point say, but I thought I thought it was something else, and then you explain what's going on. And so bit by bit, they're learning the grammar. And the way a child learns his first language, he knows all the grammar of that language by the time he's 5 or 6. And he doesn't know the words for it, right? He doesn't know this means past, and this means present, and that means future. You don't have to explain the grammar to them. You just use the grammar to them, and they'll incorporate it into their own heads. But you do want to, you can't be especially because we don't know the language fluently, most of us that are teaching it, you can't just sort of randomly teach either. You have to structure it somehow. And so, as James was saying, you might start out teaching verbs that only in the present tense. So in other words, what you're saying, you're teaching it through activities like, what are you doing? I'm sitting down, what are you doing? I'm standing there. And so you teach kids how to respond to questions, or how to ask questions, and how to answer questions about what am I doing. Later on, you'll probably start asking kids, what did you do yesterday? Or talking to them about what you did yesterday. And they're learning how to talk about the past tense that way. And then when you're talking about the big head, you'll start talking about what will we do at the big head? And you'll be talking about the future to them. And they may not learn how to talk about the past and future, but you'll start out by talking about the past and future yourself. So they'll be hearing it, and eventually you can get them to be talking about it too. So if we were teaching the prefix "un," what we would do with the kids is let's see, they'd have to be old enough to use electricity or something, but you say, plug it in, unplug it. Now plug it in, unplug it. So you're giving them commands, and they're hearing it and learning the word without the "un" and the word with the "un," and so they've learned it without you having to say. The word unplug has 2 parts to it. It has the plug part, and then it has the "un" part, which is a prefix. You don't have to say that to them at all. You just give them the words and they learn it. Now, do your languages, when you're talking about more than one thing, is there a plural form to it? So there's man versus men and so forth. And so that would be another thing, is plurals. And when you're, and you, the teacher, kind of have to know, you might be, if you're going to teach people to count things, you might have to teach people plurals. Right, so you'll have to teach that when you're saying one, you say one dog, and then 2 dogs, 3 dogs, 4 dogs. It might not be quite like English, and there's different languages have different ways of doing this, and in some languages, again, going back to Havasupai, they don't pluralize their nouns. So you just say 1 dog, 2 dog, 3 dog, 4 dog. And in English we do, but in Havasupai we don't. So Havasupai, yeah, for words for relatives, you have, you would pluralize the word for son and daughter. For example, you'd have sons and daughters. You'd have some form that means that. But for just objects and animals and so on, you don't pluralize it. But you do pluralize in Havasupai the verb, right? And so it's sort of like 3 dog, they went, right? So you have a plural marker on the verb. And so how your language talks about more than one thing will be something that you probably eventually want the kids to learn. I think the best way to teach is not to translate at all, but just to be, as much as possible, just be speaking in your language. You don't want to start with English and say, how would we say I'm going to the store in our language? Because that just invites people to try to have a series of words one by one that's in the same order as English or something like that. And instead you start with your language, and if you want to translate word for word, you can to show what it's like, but you would, but you're just using your language as the grammatical base. I mean, your language is what's the model here, not English.